Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We got the big room, but we're all spread out. So if folks want to come closer, that's great. If not, I won't make you, but please continue to participate because it is a very big room for our panelists. My name is Mikal Kurlander. I'm a faculty member, professor of education at UC Davis, and one of the faculty co-directors of PACE. And thank you for joining us for this session called Empowering the Intersegmental Agenda, Opportunities for Advancing Research and Policy at the State, Regional, and Local Level. And we have a great panel today, and I'm going to introduce them in just a minute. Before that, I just wanted to tell you that we have passed around several PACE publications in this area, in this topic. So first, we're passing out a work that was led by my colleague Sherry Reed of UC Davis and PACE called Intersegmental Data Partnerships Resource Guide, which has really useful, not just empirical work from research that my colleagues and I did of intersegmental partnerships all around the state, but actually resources for folks who are in organizations that are partnering around data use. There is a 4-page version of it also provided. And then lastly, a report that PACE recently released that links all of California high school students to National Student Clearinghouse data for 3 cohorts of students to track where California students are going to college. And we just gave you the 2-page snapshot here, but the full report, including appendices at the county level of college enrollment, is available on the PACE website. So we hope you take a look at that. We also hope that you engage with us both in the comments today in the panel and otherwise about the work that PACE is engaging in to really try to advance the intersegmental data work around the state. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panelists we have today, and I'm just going to introduce them all and then let them come one by one. So first we have Dr. Cecilia Rios-Aguilar, who first importantly is one of our newest PACE faculty co-directors. So we're so thrilled to have Dr. Rios-Aguilar join us. She is a professor of education at UCLA and also Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion at UCLA's Graduate School of Education. And Cecilia has studied for a long time students' educational and occupational trajectories with a really important focus on equity. And we're thrilled that she's joined not just this panel, but our PACE team. So thank you. Next, we have Dr. Joel Vargas, who's Vice President at Jobs for the Future, where he leads all of JFF's work in high school through college. He's written many books and authored lots of important policy work on the space of trying to strengthen the pipeline to college from middle school on, and in particular reminds us, as one of the title of his books, to mind the gap for students around the transitions to college, and has a lot to say around how to strengthen the opportunities for college going. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Alicia Smith-Arriaga, who's one of the executive directors of EdTrust West, and formerly was the director of Career Ladders Project for the Foundation for California Community Colleges, and also serves in California in the advisory task force on alternative schools. And I've gotten to know Alicia over the last couple of years, who's doing really important work in strengthening community engagement around improving the pathway to college and careers. And so I invited them all to participate because I've been inspired by all of their efforts, particularly in this space, to try to improve educational attainment for students in our state with a real important focus on equity. So thank you for joining me, and they each have about 15 to 20 minutes, and we'll make sure we leave plenty of room for discussion and for some questions that I've sent them in advance. So
thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Did you guys get coffee? Because it's going to be needed, probably. Always, being after lunch is always a tough spot. But anyways, I want to thank, of course, PACE for inviting me to this panel. And I also want to say thank you to my intellectual partners. None of these ideas are mine. I'm not that smart, so I always have to thank Mikal for always offering encouragement and always support in bouncing back ideas. And 2 of my students who are here, Austin and Teresita, they're fundamental in pushing me thinking about this. So thank you very much. Sorry, I just named this Re-envisioning the Intersegmental Agenda. As Mikal said, I'm a researcher who's been interested for the longest time in educational, what I've always described as educational and occupational trajectories of marginalized or underrepresented students. So for me, this type of work is natural. I never talked about it in intersegmental ways, but I've always been interested in early childhood. Even I'm that type of researcher who has published something in an early childhood journal, and I sometimes publish stuff related to labor market and how students make decisions about careers and jobs. So I've been that lucky to be able to have that flexibility in my research to look at these various things. I wanted to give us a little bit of context before I start putting some of the ideas that we've collaboratively been thinking about how to re-envision this intersegmental agenda. Current context, right? There's this talk about cradle to career. And for me, what that means is, how do we keep thinking about systems? Not so much about one sector versus the other, or one has more money than the other, or more interest, or one is the one to be blamed for all the deficiencies or whatever misgivings. It's about how we think of this as structures and systems that we need to rethink so that we can really address equity issues. That's what I really wanted to propose here. As you know, the new governor reinvigorated us to push thinking in this, and there's concrete things on the budget, right? On free community college, early quality childcare programs. I mean, the list is extensive, but it's attending to this idea of creating systems and putting money on them, okay? More context. I'm going to give you the research because I'm a researcher, so what would I do without my numbers? I don't know. But in 2010, when I was trying to also to understand these trajectories, my colleagues, Regina Dillamen and Stephanie De Luca, who are sociologists, came up with this idea of the underserved third. They basically, what they did is they examined national data from the National Educational Longitudinal Study, NELS, and they said, there's this underclass of students. We're in this college for all ideology, trying to push everybody to go to college, but if you take a look at the data, there's an actual underserved third of students who are not college for ready, not ready for college, and not ready for any career or vocational program. And that's what they called the underserved third, right? And again, we are basically what we are is producing this group of students who are structurally positioned to fail, because they may go to higher education, some of them, they enroll mostly in community colleges, in remedial courses, they don't finish college, and they don't end up getting the labor market rewards that we so promise from higher education, right? So we said, you know, let's re-examine that data. We have new data. This was in 2010. We did this effort, and we said, let's look again at the data, high school longitudinal study data. And this is a paper me and my colleagues presented at AERA last year. And what we found is that the third grew to a half. So a half of this group comprised, like I said, mostly low-income students, students of color, overrepresented in community colleges and in certificate programs in remedial classes. So inequity has increased. A third is now a half. And at the same time as we're trying to make sense of this underserved group, our colleague Gene Rosenbaum and his colleagues at Northwestern end up publishing this report called The New Forgotten Half, which again calculates out the half of students who are going to go to college but accumulate credits and actually have no credential or degree. Again, structurally positioned to fail in the labor market. They're going to have basically no benefit from going and entering in college, except the accumulation of credits. So we were trying to understand and make sense of this, and for me, this idea of cumulative disadvantage goes very well hand in hand with this policy context of the cradle-to-career context. Just to give you some numbers, this is what we find of that underserved group of students. And these are significant numbers of students of color that are being structurally positioned to fail. And that, to me, is unacceptable. And these are national numbers. I get this is not California, but this gives us some context to start thinking, what do we need to do different if we want to change the life trajectories of these people? These are people behind these beautiful statistics that we were able, their lives at stake here, right? And mostly students of color, low-income students of color. Again, this idea of the cradle to career appeals to me if we think of these as structures and systems, not as students failing themselves, right? Let's be very clear that the ones that are not failing is the systems and the structures, not the students. We sometimes want to attribute that the students are the ones failing, but is they're being structurally positioned to fail. Right? So there's a big difference there. So what I want to propose to you is a series of ideas. I don't have any data yet. Maybe in 2 more PACE conferences, we can have some more concrete things to bring back. And again, this is just one way to think about it. By no means I found the panacea or the only idea to think about intersegmental. These are just some thoughts and ideas to put equity at the center of our agenda. I think there's a lot going on with LCFF that SCFF can now learn from. But we need to put equity again at the center, okay? This is part of a proposition. There's been already, how many, 5 years of LCFF? People are learning a lot. Sometimes Ed a little bit brought us the complexity and maybe the issues that we need to still work and think about, but I still think there's a lot to learn from that effort that the community college sector in particular can learn from, since they are the ones serving the most number of underserved students, right? So let me try to propose and be concrete about some policy questions that I think are important. In 3 areas: investments, implementation, and of course, equity. Are our investments paying off? I want to be able to go back to the governor and say, we track these expenses. We track actually and made sure it reached the students that it needs to reach. ELLs, low income, homeless, foster youth. Note how LCFF defines very concretely equity along these lines, right? There are some efforts. I was able to have a conversation with the former director of the California Collaborative Educational Excellence, I think, with Carl Cohen before I came here to make sure I was not saying something off. And he told me there are concrete efforts, but it may require cracking the accountability code. And that's a very difficult nut to crack. But it's not impossible. Some people are already started to doing it. But we need more, I think, of those efforts to track expenses. I have a colleague at UCLA who has this phrase on his email. Don't show me what you value. It's a quote from Joe Biden. Show me your budget, and I'll show you what you value. Right? Kind of the same idea. Tell me what you're spending the money so I know really what you are valuing and what you're putting in practice, in action, right? In the higher ed sector, we're thinking of equity in a different way. Yeah? We have this new funding formula that has these 3 components: access, enrollment, basically, then an equity component defined by number of low-income and low-income adult students. But there are some pragmatic and important issues to think about that. So my push for all of us here is to think about the investments, but also about what are we investing on? Are we making sure the investments are going to these populations that desperately need the money? And how are we going to make sure that's going to happen, right? Implementation. What are institutions actually doing, right? can we identify not only best practices, but best processes? Practices maybe starting to be a limited concept if we don't think of this systematically. We want best processes that may be linked also to other sectors, right? And I can give you an example. LCAP and the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, and they have some efforts, right? The kitchen, the test kitchen. We're trying to make sure, again, that those investments, but that institutions align their budgets with priorities, with transparency. We're trying to find those models that work. Higher ed, the community college sector in particular, could learn tremendously from that effort. We don't need to reinvent everything. We're supposed to be worrying about the exact same populations. But the problem is we're starting to talk about them in very different ways and to define them in very different ways. We don't know anything right now about how community colleges are going to do that. But I would hate to lose the investment and the effort in the K through 12. And then just think about the ELLs, for example. We invest so much. They're legally protected. The minute they step one foot in the community college sector or wherever higher in the education institution, we do not even know how they're going to be labeled, what type of language services they're going to need. So all the investment basically could go to the trash, and we will start from scratch. I work with a lot of community colleges, and they are telling me that students are going to now self-identify, because also there's no more remedial education, AB 705. So it seems that we're starting to enter into contradictions and very difficult things that if we talk to each other more, we could start rethinking and really, really try to understand. It's not just a data, building a longitudinal data system for me. It's about how are we serving? Are we really reaching out to students? How are we serving them? Because it's not just enough to say, oh, we'll have a data, we'll flag the student, and we'll be able to know where the student is once they enter the... Yeah, but if the student is not supported, if they don't have language services, they're being structurally positioned to fail. The final, equity. I think we need to start asking ourselves more clearly who gets what and where. For the longest time, I think, and like I said, we are so worried about these populations in K through 12. In higher ed, the way we think about them is just low-income students, defined by Pell eligibility, by whether they qualify for the College Promise Grant, and they're very different. They're very different groups. So I think we really gotta take a step back and think about these equity issues much, much, much carefully. I'm gonna show you a graph that, I had Austin in one of our discussions about, okay, Pell eligibility. If we only take a look at that as an equity measure in higher education, we're gonna be ignoring a bunch of people because the number of Pell recipients over time has decreased significantly. And this is in overall, right? So if we only consider low income and not the previous categories, ELLs, foster, we seem to start unmasking a lot of significant problems if we just start talking about income as the only category, as our only way, and not being consistent in how we are making those definitions and how we're tracking those students. Again, systems, the financial aid, a whole very complicated system that we haven't touched, but that will impact every single student that comes from the K through 12 sector, right? So I just want to finish there and say that this is just some ideas. These are by no means definite, but these are some of what's been informing the way we want to work, the way we want to collaborate with K through 12, with early childhood. These are tough questions, but I feel if we don't answer them and if we don't pay attention to them, we're going to be just finding new ways to reproduce inequities and to keep accumulating this advantage in our state. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank McCall and Pace for inviting me to talk with you today. I have a much, touching on the same topics, but from a much different perspective from JFF's work supporting regional intersegmental collaborations. I kind of go by cross-sector, but I know that the translation in California is intersegmental. So anyway, I have to get used to that language again. And I'm going to be a little cheeky with the charge I was given, which is to talk about the conditions needed to advance intersegmental collaborations. And I actually extended that to say we've learned that it's really about a set of not only conditions, but also competencies and cognitive shifts that need to happen about partnerships. And, you know, I say it with a lot of humility because we're still learning a lot from the hard work of leaders that we're supporting at the regional level primarily and somewhat at the state level. But we have sort of a working set of hypotheses that come out of some research that we've done that has complemented the support that we've provided to these regional collaboratives. So that's really the theme of my talk. What I want to do first is just talk about JFF. We go by JFF now, but people know us probably as Jobs for the Future. But we're going to try JFF for a little while and see if it's a little more catchy. We'll see, yeah. We go through these bouts every once in a while, back and forth. But our mission has always been the same, and it's really about trying to design and scale up strategies that better align our education and workforce systems and transform them so that we have fewer low-income youth and adults falling through the cracks. And we know who those populations tend to be. And we have been working for over 35 years as a nonprofit trying to solve that problem, working with policymakers, working with systems leaders, institutions, foundations to advance those solutions. I came from our Boston headquarters, where I was for about 13 years before moving out to California 4 years ago to open our office in Oakland. And it's a pleasure to be back in my home state and a chance to have a big impact. These are exciting times. So this is just a summary of how we do our work, which my mom asks me, and then she still kind of walks away scratching her head. But it's about scale. It is about continuous improvement at scale. So I'm glad I'm at the right conference. It's about bringing ideas into action. It's about prototyping, advising system leaders, policymakers, foundations on strategy, to creating and leading networks that spread these ideas and influencing policies and practices. And the focus is really on ensuring that individuals have a brighter future for economic advancement, that employers have the employees that they need, the talent that they need, and that our economy needs, and also that our systems are able to adapt to the rapidly changing nature of work and the future of work that's coming with increasing advances in automation and artificial intelligence, just to name a few forces. So one of the projects that we've had the pleasure of supporting when we came out to California, and we continue to do this work, including around data use as well, but is supporting collaboratives that are trying to improve the transition for low-income youth into college and careers. And my passion, as McCall alluded to earlier, is about really trying to actually do that by incorporating college and career experiences into the default high school experience. And there were two initiatives that we've supported since coming out to California and continue to, just in different ways. One is the Career Pathways Trust, which is a $500 million investment made by the state starting in 2014. Another is the ongoing work on linked learning that goes on throughout the state. And there were bets made by both of those initiatives that part of the strategy for sustaining and scaling them up would be by working through regions and creating cross-sector intersegmental collaborations, because to design the pathways and to scale them up required really intense knitting between the K-12 system, community colleges, CSU, and workforce development systems and employers to make sure that those systems were working together in ways that created more seamless transitions for youth. So that was the bet, and that through regional collaboration, those systems could be built. So we were proud and continue to be proud to support that work. I'm going to just read out a couple of quotations from a couple of pieces of research that we have, and I guess all the slides are available to you, so you'll see the citations if you just look them up. My communications people are going to kill me because I forgot the links, but they're very easy to Google, and they'll pop right up. This one was a quote from research that was led by Milbury McLaughlin, Professor Emeritus at Stanford, who looked at the Career Pathways Trust regional consortia and talked with many of them about their experiences. And I think I'm going to read a couple of quotes and then just kind of cue up the rest of my comments from there. Collaborative arrangements that fail, one regional leader reflected, usually fail because organizers forgot about transformation, about having a really general purpose and asking, what does business care about? What does K-12 education care about? Community colleges. It's a longer time horizon. Most so-called collaborations fail because they begin in a transactional mode, calling out immediate needs and how to meet them. And here's a quotation from a regional leader of a Career Pathways Trust region and Link Learning region. Importantly, I've learned to be patient. Systems change is arduous work. It takes time to see progress even when we don't always know exactly what we're trying to achieve. And our partners contribute at different levels and speeds. The important thing is that they continue as partners. So I guess what I would have you take away from this, although you can draw your own conclusions, is this is really long-term work. These leaders came to conclude that it is really about trying to transform their practice and their systems. It doesn't happen in one grant cycle, especially short grant cycles like the ones we know we tend to respond to. And that entails systems change, just as a shorthand term. And that really became the focus of work of regional collaboratives that we have high hopes will continue on and actually, over the years, achieve the kind of long-term ambitious changes that are going to be needed to make career pathways, better high school to college transitions the norm across the state. That's what's going to be needed, is that sustained continuous improvement work. And this is what it would look like if you were achieving systems changes. How would you know your systems are changing? It's a change in habits, a change in ideas and values within your organizations and across systems, a change in power, sharing power, distributed power, a change in technologies or skills, or a change in money, just to name a few. And the column on the left here is what we depicted as what we've seen in the field as what tends to be the norm when a grant comes out and an initiative is started. It can be very good and they can be very valuable, and both Link Learning and Career Pathways Trust started a lot of great programming for young people. But they tend to focus on short-term, again, grant cycle goals. One-to-one partnerships can be built, formal initiative MOUs that maybe span beyond that, hopefully, beyond that particular initiative. But largely based on individual relationships, really aimed at program-specific outputs, et cetera. And really, what we want to see is more of a shift towards coalitions that aim towards a common mission, that have capacity and investments in their capacity to partner into the future, and that focus on systemic impact and sustained transformation. So that was our aim. So, I'm having technological difficulties today. This was my graphic slide too. Oh, shucks. Did I do that? Yay. Thank you. You've been a lifesaver. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you. Thought you were shutting me down. What does the leadership look like? So really at the micro level, right? If you're an actor in these systems, we worked with Equal Measure and Harder & Company, who are our formative evaluators for the Link Learning Hubs of Excellence regional work. And we kind of collectively came up with this framework about the kinds of ways of working skills and dispositions. The link is down there for folks who want to, or at least the citation for folks who want to drill down into these. Without going into each one of these and killing you and running out my clock here, I would just emphasize that what they have in common is the problem that you're solving here with leadership is you're not in a command and control situation when you're in these partnerships. You actually have to exercise influence in other ways. Across systems and people you don't control. And that is, if you can figure out how to do that to build systems across, to actually pursue a common agenda and influence leaders in other systems around whom you have no formal control, that is a huge leadership set of competencies that are needed that people don't normally have or are trained in. And then there was sort of a mind shift. Oh, forget it. Is that a mind shift or what? My slides are, let me see if I can. Okay, there we go. I don't know what I'm doing today. I'm sorry, it's like static or something. There was a mind shift in how we sort of asked our leaders to conceive of their work collectively. And most people, and we unfortunately perpetuated this for a while, we said, well, there's a power center, there's a convener, okay? It's the people they're gonna make decisions about the money. And then there's a hub and spoke model and all the communications run through that leader. And then you're gonna come up with governance structures, work plans, get those pathways done. Okay, that was an important kind of, that objective, right idea in some respects, but it's gonna lead very much to hard feelings, kind of politics, and maybe not much beyond the short-lived initiative. And when we talked to leaders, we said, you know, really the kind of mind shift was, so we had someone come up and say, so you want us to create more pathways and get more students into the pathways, right? And I said, yes, we do. But we really want you to build the systems that in turn create more pathways and get more students into the pathways in perpetuity. It's about building your capacity to do that as a region, learning to operate outside of your silos, and building a new infrastructure for collaboration. So they identified these needs, and that was what we identified as a work. That was a huge cognitive shift for those regions. And we asked them to think in these terms instead of less as a hub and spoke and more as a network, more as a constellation of actors who could mobilize around different initiatives to pursue common North Star goals. And that those are really the networks that are needed over time for the systems changes to create the new flows of ideas and dollars and power sharing that I referred to earlier. So again, I'm running out of time, so I'm skating over things, but it's more of a network kind of frame with nodes rather than hubs. And then, you know, I think for in terms of state conditions that go macro and end here, for as well-intentioned as exciting as a lot of the investments have been over the past several years, and it seems like we'll have another year of those as well, it actually kind of ironically acted against some of those instincts we were trying to encourage at the regional level, because the state would just throw new monies, new programs, new initiatives at the regions, and guess what would happen? Especially if players had the hub and spoke kind of model in their mind, they would just run after the next thing and not see the relationship necessarily between, you know, the work of Career Pathways Trust and CTIG, the next round of career and technical education funding. And that could really be a distraction. And the state agencies didn't have really the structures, the coordinated structures to communicate to the field about how these things might be related. New initiatives could be pursued and leveraged towards common sustained goals. And there was a mixed bag in terms of being able to invest, and we encourage us to actually invest in the partnership capacities in any grant initiative that are needed to pull off these kind of ambitious intersegmental agendas. So we have some ideas that are in a paper written by Marty Alvarado and myself, Joel Vargas. If you just look up our names and type in State and Career Pathways Trust or some combination of the above, we drill down on these, and maybe we'll have an opportunity to take some Q&A about that. But I'll end there. That was sort of an individual look, a regional look, and then a state look at the conditions and the skill sets that people need to pull these kinds of regional collaborations off for powerful impact. So thanks for the time. Sorry about all the tech difficulties. Alicia, I hope you have a better...
Okay, let's see. All right, it worked. Maybe. Can you hear me? All right, I'm going to do something a little unorthodox because I know it's 2:15 on a Friday afternoon. As I ready, stand up really quick. I want you to look to your left, look to your right. Now give the person on your left a high five. All right, the person on your right a high five. All right. Okay. You were just intersegmental in your So thanks for humoring me with that. I have a 4-year-old, so we do a lot of high fives in my house. And this afternoon, in the next 10 minutes, I'm hoping we can do a high five at the end around how we put equity at the center of intersegmental partnerships and systems. So I am the co-executive director of the Education Trust West, and I stand here today, I feel like, with 2 hats. One is the hat of being a long-term California resident, but native of Mississippi, and the daughter of some civil rights advocates there. And so that is what's in my blood. That's what brings me to this work. And then the other part of me is here as the product of intersegmental partnerships. Some official, some unofficial. But, I think back to high school when I was in college prep programs, and then I think back to when I was in college and I was in grad school programs. So those partnerships, whether official or unofficial, are things that move students through, right? They help them see what that next step could be in their educational journey, and that's one of the reasons that intersegmental partnerships are so important. So with both of those hats on, I'm really thrilled and I feel really honored and humbled, maybe this is cord, to do the work I do today at the Education Trust West. And that work is, we are a nonprofit educational equity organization. And we're the West Coast office. And even though we call ourselves Ed Trust West, we work in California. And we work to close opportunity and achievement gaps, but we do that through using research, data, policy, analysis, and advocacy. So the way we like to think about that is if the world, there we go, is the Grand Canyon, and there are communities on one side and policymakers and researchers on other, we try and stand in that gap, which is why there's a blue space on the screen. I am standing in the gap right now. So that is what we hope to do. So with that, what I'm gonna take us through today are really just 3 quick principles that we think about in our work, especially that are important in forming intersegmental systems that have equity at the center. Now, these 3 principles and the way that I'm gonna talk about them is, one thing that we talk about a lot is equity. And I love the way that Sean Harper always says, but how do we do equity? Like, what does that look like? And if we put equity at the center of an intersegmental partnership, like we went out on the street right now and we said, hey, how do you put equity at the center of an intersegmental partnership? What kind of answers do you think we would get? I don't know. So we're gonna try and make this touchable, feelable, palpable for you to be able to take back some ideas to your communities. So the first principle is to engage students and communities early and often. And I know this is not rocket science. You might be like, well, I thought that already. Maybe that's not new. But we're often surprised, right, at how not often this happens. So one way that we try and do this at Education Trust West, and this can look a lot of different ways, is that we use data equity walks, which are a tool to really take publicly available data, but engage communities with that data. So we've done this now with over 5,000 folks, students as young as 12, adults, policymakers, as well as parents, And what this looks like is usually, if we had time to do it now, there would be music on, which there's no music, so that's how you know there's not a data equity walk happening at this very moment. But we would put on some music, and there would be a lot of data as well around the room. And we would not have drawn conclusions for you to come to with that data, but you yourself as a participant would be engaging with it. Perhaps looking at data that showed differences in suspension rates in K-12 schools. Also looking in a region at how those rates look in higher ed. What do the preschool rates look like? And what we've seen from that is students as young as we had a data equity walk in a middle school, and some students were looking at the data, engaging with it, and then the superintendent came in the room and he said, oh, you know, I just wanted to come and say, I'm so glad you guys are looking at this data. And they said, well, we're glad you're here too, because can you tell us why there's so many suspensions at this school and not at that school? And what are you going to do about that? What's your policy solution? How are you partnering with the local college to make sure that we can go into college? Because we see at this high school, our college going rates are not as high as at this other school. So really, you know, not starting with the research question before, but really centering that in what students, parents, families are wanting to know to be able to change and push systems to operate together better, to really put them at the center. Principle number 2 is developing resources that advocates can use. I want to say I love the, Mikhail held up in the beginning, the 4-page version of the report. We all know we love to read, but time is limited. And with that, that means that folks engage with research in different kinds of ways. But if we really want to do what we were saying in principle number 1, right, engage communities and stakeholders in ways that are authentic, we want to make sure we're providing that information in a lot of different kinds of ways. So I'm going to show an example of a video that our leader organization, but our national organization, Ed Trust, put together that's actually about putting equity at the center of dual enrollment, right? So how can high schools and colleges work together on dual enrollment? And this tool is a parent-facing tool that they're actually using with a lot of parent organizers now. Let me see if I can get the link to work. So we just watched a great video. It happened. All right, thanks for your patience. So finally, principle 3, highlight promising partnership examples that have equity at the center. Now, what I've highlighted here is just, really a graphic that says, hey, if you know of great examples of PK through 12 and college, university, workforce examples, share them with other folks. And the equity at the centerpiece, though, is really key here. So there was, before I wore the Ed Trust West hat, as McCall said, I was working with alternative high schools and community colleges across the state. And one of the things that was really wonderful about that experience was working in alternative high schools across the state, where there are actually 10% of California's juniors and seniors are in alternative high schools. We were working as part of the Career Pathways Trust to build pathways between the high schools and their local colleges. So sometimes when you think about intersegmental partnerships, folks are really focused on, to Cecilia's point, not that third or the half, right? They're focused on folks who are like college ready, and they're about, in their view, about to move on to that next step. But what I would really urge us to do in thinking about intersegmental partnerships is to think about those students who actually don't come to mind first. And what would happen sometimes when we work with a lot of alternative high schools is we walk in and we say, hey, we're here to talk about pathways to college. And we get the response, well, why? And my response to that would be, well, have you asked any students if they're interested in college? Because there's a college actually right across the street. And there was a lot of beautiful work that started happening across the street, across the state, where we bring together educators from the alternative high school and from the local community college, and they say, hey, well, if our students just knew how to fill out the application, maybe they would be able to go there. Or maybe if we'd done that math last year instead of this year, then our students would be more prepared. And we started seeing curriculums change on the alternative high school side to actually more closely match what students would need going into some of those colleges. And then in some of those sites, we started to see graduation rates rise for some of the high school students who now saw college as a possibility when that had not been something that had been presented to them in the past. So what I mean here when I say putting equity at the center of intersegmental partnerships is really thinking about all groups of students, not just those who, pop in your mind first, but all students equally deserve the opportunity to move between various systems. So with that, I'm going to thank you and thank you for your patience with the technology and look forward to any questions.
So we're going to do some Q&A, and I'll start. So while I start, you can all be thinking of some questions. And I've shared these with our panelists, so hopefully I won't be catching them off guard. But first, let's just first thank all of them for some really inspiring remarks. So I think one of the things that I wanted to ask was this bridging this research and policy. And so I guess since many of you work across both spaces, I wanted in this effort to ask your opinion about do we need more research on sort of, or is it more around research use, right, data use? And how have you seen evidence and research used in your collaborations in a way that have really shifted thinking from, if it's two segments, each segment? So any or all of you to respond?
Maybe I can start since I'm the researcher. Yes, Joel is always like, you answer that one. I think there's definitely a need for research, but the research needs to be much more aligned to practice. Just those suggestions, 2 pages, very focused on even the data walks. I do not the data walks necessarily with students, but I do it with administrators. I hand out 2 pages in our meetings as to what we find in their institution, and then we talk about it together. So I think the more opportunities you can to do those and then interpret together, ask questions together, I think there's definitely need for more research, but the research has to be more focused on the issues that matter to the institutions, to practitioners, and on the use of that, in my opinion.
I think I'm building a variation on that theme. One is we've noticed that people who are interested in using data start with like, let's get that MOU and start sharing data. And I need access to that data. How do we get access to that data? And it's almost the wrong place to start. It really has to begin with powerful questions that reflect a shared interest and a shared interest in understanding the answers to the question. And it takes a lot of trust building. So forgive me, I can't remember her name, but the woman from the Silicon Valley Trust, Data Trust, really stressed the trust in their name. And you do have to build that almost first. It's foundational in order to be able to then get access to the data, use it for answering powerful questions. So.
Yeah, I totally agree with what both Joel and Cecilia pointed out. And the only other thing I would add is that I've seen this beautiful thing that happens when you start with building the trust and building relationship and just providing like the data that is available. And then all of a sudden people start to say, well, is there any research that supports that? And then, they're like, well, could you bring in someone from the university to go over this paper that shows like why this is the case? So often, to building that trust and kind of doing that initial work can lead to the really beautiful intersection of research and policy and practice at the same time.
Okay, I'm going to open up the floor, and I recognize many people in the room, many of them who have participated in very successful intersegmental partnerships that include data, and some maybe that don't include data. So I hope, in addition to asking questions, you can also introduce yourself and mention the work you're doing in this space. So I open up the floor. Yes, please. There's a mic coming your way.
So I was intrigued by our keynote speaker this morning. And I want to ask a question that's kind of in the Simon Sinek framework of like, how do you make a compelling why for intersegmental partnerships that creates a fertile environment for people to see past the short term and their narrow self-interest?
It's a great question. I mean, speaking out of both sides of my mouth, sometimes you can start with their narrow and self-interested selves. One of the things we found that we really had to coach around was, let's take linked learning collaboratives. Really a K-12 initiative, but an approach that can really be applied to post-secondary and workforce development systems as well, broadly applicable. But often the regional partnerships were approached by having K-12 leaders metaphorically sort of knocking on the door of their local post-secondary institutions and their employers and saying, you know, you need to do this for us and we need to work together. And employers, you know, we need you to do this for our kids. Instead of, I'm being exaggerating for effect here, but you know, essentially that was the subtext versus speak in terms of what kind of value proposition this offers for each person, the person depending on where they sit in their system and the goals they're trying to advance. And you have to sort of start and do the translation into their system space reform initiatives. You know, you don't say one person's career pathways is maybe another's strong workforce, you know, in the community college sector. They're very aligned kinds of goals. So in part, it's doing the translation, speaking in terms of what's going to matter to the person for their work, and then defining kind of a shared agenda.
I think in addition to that, I would always bring the student voices. That's why the beginning of your presentation was essential. You start with the student voices and the family's voices and the community to make a why case. All the partnerships that I have with community colleges right now in particular I tell them, I only start if we start listening to students first and bringing these multiple voices that could help us articulate a better why to the rest of the partners. But I think starting with that, I think is very important.
I think I would agree with both of those points. And then starting with the student voice and also actually centering the conversation in data, because often people have the same problem they're trying to solve. Like I've said in schools where they've said, hey, we want to know how many of our students are going to that college across the street. And the college says, yeah, we want to know how many of our students are coming from your school so we can figure out how we can. So that data often lifts up this common problem, and then everybody has skin in the game to try and solve it.
So I'm Raquel Donoso. In my previous position, I directed the Mission Promise neighborhood. So we developed intersegmental, though we didn't call it that, data systems and research agenda to really hone in on what's working. How do we grow that? How do we stop some things that are not in this cradle to college pathway? And one of the things in this discussion about a statewide system that gets me a little anxious is we've done so much work around finance to think about locally. What do districts need? What do schools need? How do we actually funnel money in a way that is much more local decision making? And this discussion is very big statewide around the longitudinal data system, which I understand. But I guess my question is like, how can more local voices and local needs and local power be included in that discussion so we can actually build something that's going to work for people on the ground?
It's a great question, Raquel. I mean, I actually think that question is the biggest thing in all caps that we need to do next in terms of a state data system, because at least I've been sitting in a lot of rooms recently with, a lot of similar folks, and we've been having conversations about the data system. But one thing that is unnerving is it's not clear to me that anybody's been actually having those same conversations in communities across the state. And we know that there are a lot of really positive outcomes that can come out of a state data system. But if we're not out there in communities, having conversations with folks, letting them know that, hey, this is coming, the state is thinking about it. What are your thoughts? How are you thinking about it? What questions are you trying to answer? Those are conversations that need to be happening now. I mean, one of the things that we're working on at Trust West is actually trying to develop some materials in partnership with some of the other folks in this room that are more community-facing materials around the fact that the data system conversation is happening, and trying to think about ways to engage communities more broadly in that conversation as well.
Yeah, I would add to that and say, in some ways the problem of not having a statewide data system for so long has created a lot of interesting homegrown, regional, local solutions. So there is, and those should be indicators of where there's demand for this and some expertise and capacity. Because at the end of the day, what you would hate to have happen is sort of having the data system be set up and say, oh, that problem is solved. When, again, you won't be surprised to hear me preach, it's really about the relationships and the trust building and the value proposition for why do we need these data in the first place. That takes a lot of work. It's not a technical problem. Of course, there are technical problems, but these are adaptive problems. So these, my guess is places like Silicon Valley Data Trust, with only having heard about them for the first time today, or the work that's going on that has gone on in Long Beach for some time around data and otherwise, those are great places to begin to understand how do you begin to build the demand to use the data.
I think I agree with you that the data system for me is still, like you say, at the the state. But I think of parents, I think of other stakeholders, and that's why I think that cannot be the only way. We need to think about this intersegmental work, and also knowing that in the data, even we were talking in the morning in my table about. We think of this so linearly in a data system, and students are shifting, moving back and forth. There's a lot of movement that a data set may not be able to capture, right? So therefore, we need to get alternative modes of, and I keep thinking the old school town halls, the old school going and knocking in people's doors and organizing people to talk about some of these issues, that we cannot lose that part of this process just in giving our faith to a data set, right? That will magically now transform our equity issues. I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay, and just a quick shout out to Pam here I spoke with this morning, where they're also importantly, we're talking about spaces between K-12 and higher ed, but similarly, we have a lot of examples around the state happening locally or regionally where we have pre-K to K data sharing and intersegmental work. So I just want to highlight that since the focus hasn't been as much about that. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Now you can.
Yes.
So that's a wonderful segue to my thought/question. I apologize for the lack of real question necessarily. I'm Beth Malloy. I'm at the Learning Policy Institute, and I focus on early learning. And so I'm excited to see the nods towards pre-K, and mostly because right now in early learning, we're in a situation where we're very concerned about some very serious workforce development issues. I'm wondering, as I look at sort of the cradle to career, and there's cradle and career is the endpoint, and we have all of these places in which people are students in between, and thinking about how the career aspect of that can feed back into the system. And so thinking about developing early educators and not structurally positioning them to fail as they go back to school and try and educate themselves and move up career ladders. So it would just really struck me that that's an important piece to remember as a possible way to reconnect with the systems you're trying to get to connect and help students succeed, that they're also feeding back into their own systems.
That's great.
I think that's one of the ideal things that could emerge from this conversation, that they can look at these different ways to do intersegmental
I agree, we should maybe think about whether we want to continue talking about intersegmental, because nobody seems to be using the word. But those are important ideas, right? Because those are, I think the shifts and the movements and possibilities around that, I think would be, you know, an extremely great example of next level of work that we should be doing, in just not focusing on these linear trajectories, but there's so much movement in between and possibilities. So I think that's a fabulous idea that I'm going to definitely make note of.
Yeah, I don't know if this adds value to your great question and observation. It's just, yes, it's a classic intersegmental problem. I mean, in some ways, we're not going to be able to achieve the ambition around early learning without reprofessionalizing that workforce, because it's working poor or in that profession. We've structured it. I think you were alluding to this right now. I mean, it's structurally, it's for poor. Yeah, it can be technically. I mean, right now it's a trap, almost the way it's set up. So as I've talked with other colleagues, I forget, I'm not going to attribute it, but it's a broken business model right now. So we have to figure out if we're going to be able to pull this off, and it's going to take multiple systems figuring out how do you change that equation.
It's incidentally in our work one of the lowest sort of routes. If you look at sort of different career technical education certificates at the community colleges and the units, and it reaps some of the least rewards in the labor market. No surprise to folks. And yes, I think Mike. Does Mike have the mic?
Yeah, Mike Hurst, Professor Emeritus at Stanford. I want to talk with this panel a little bit more about dual enrollment. The time for dual enrollment is really coming and already has come, because we have very significant declines in community college enrollment in California coming up, and some are already there. And the colleges traditionally have never been interested in dual enrollment unless they need students, and now they need students in many, many places, so this is the time. A problem is the state policy on dual enrollment was set up in a period when there was so-called scandals. Students were getting dual enrollment credit for summer athletic programs, and they were sort of padding the budget. So California has not stepped back recently and said, if we want to promote dual enrollment, what would good state laws look like? What would be the leadership here? So it's very hard when you talk to community college chancellors locally about getting some of their people to be in the high school teachers and qualifying them. They have all sorts of workaround contracts they work with. There's union issues about substitution of jobs. But I'm wondering, and Joel, I know you've worked on this for years, and obviously Ed Trust West is interested. So I think what I would recommend is some group to step back and say, are these state laws inhibiting it? How could we do a positive state law rather than a negative state law around dual enrollment?
Yeah, and I know Alicia is going to have something to say about this too, and we partnered because I think part of my answer, Mike, is also making sure that we don't. Let me just step back for a second. Dual enrollment is increasing in the state. I mean, it's sort of looking since the Holden bill passed in 2015 or so, it's really doubled, from 30,000 to 60,000 at last count. Probably still on the rise, a lot catching up to do proportionately, of course, even our big state, but to other states that do more dual enrollment and kind of use it as a strategy for increasing college completion with a focus on underserved populations. So, what does it take to get from here to there? I think what we worry about, and working with Career Ladders Project, we've written about this recently. We come out with a couple of pieces around the history that you described, Mike, and sort of the opportunities in the state. Not to have everybody kind of go down to the lowest, to the low-hanging fruit, because then you create an equity problem. It's sort of like if colleges are hungry for enrollment, dual enrollment is incentivized through the dashboard for K-12. Guess what happens next? Find me kids who are ready for dual enrollment, and we know that they're not going to be the students who could benefit with some support. Data show that nationally, that underrepresented students with the right support can be successful and avail themselves of the benefits of dual enrollment. A lot of it has to do with putting out a vision and coherence in a state that's so huge as California, with seemingly little this is pretty low on a leadership agenda, where we've seen in other states a governor will actually kind of use a bully pulpit to promote dual enrollment in early college approaches is a part of a college completion strategy. So short of that, what kind of field needs to be built to build the capacity? Because there are bright spots in the state of practices that serve those students that need to benefit the most from these strategies. How do we spread that kind of word and help people adapt the principles to their context so that it spreads with quality? So that's kind of what we're thinking about given the state of the fractured field here.
Yeah, and I would just echo the sentiment around, I mean, one big policy piece has to be around the supports that are in place so that it is an equitable process. I mean, some of what we saw on the ground in schools across the state that worked really well was, you know, if a high school had a dual enrollment class and students had never taken a college class before, you know, there's all kinds of, well, if you get an F, what does that mean? Is it on your full-time transcript? So how do you set up a situation in which a student who maybe hasn't had that experience before has a positive experience when they're in dual enrollment because it's their first college experience? So what we saw were a lot of successful partnerships when folks partner with their after-school program to put in a study hall so that students who were in the dual enrollment class were able to have that extra support. So policies that support kind of that, how do you put in the wraparound pieces to ensure that the students who are most vulnerable are actually getting served and are being successful in dual enrollment is an important policy piece too.
I'll just add, Mike, on this on a data piece of this. So we know that, I agree with Joel, that we see increases in dual enrollment participation, and we can track students who are currently high school students taking classes at community colleges. And what you also see is plenty of non-low income students taking many students have decoded the sort of usefulness of taking a community college course to get ahead, either to get into college or to, you know, satisfy a requirement. But our data systems also limit us from being able to look at those pockets of high schools that are doing it well because they're not integrated well enough to be able to tell we can see students in the community college system, but we don't necessarily track which high school they came from, what teacher and the credentials they have. And so this is yet another example where we would be able to go much further into communities that are doing it well or not doing it at all if we had better data to find them. So I just wanted to add that. I know there was but yes. Oh. Okay. Oh, yes, right here. Please.
I've got you.
Thank you. So this is a slightly wonky question, numbers question, but I don't know if anybody else here saw the EdSource interview about 4 weeks ago on early childhood education. And there was one educator in Tulare County who was talking about the wonderful things they were doing with their supplemental and concentration grant funds in the early childhood area. Then there was another educator from Berkeley talking about how their buildings were crumbling. And if you're, I'm with Educator State, I'm a volunteer, a research director, and we are parent-led, so we're the whole state, so we look at everybody. And if you're a wonky person, you know that the cost of living in Tulare County is about 20% less than the state average, and you know that the cost of living in Alameda County is about 10% above it. So what you're seeing there is a 30% gap, but we're holding educators in both places accountable for using their supplemental and concentration grants for underserved community, well, you know, specifically for unduplicated children. So I was wondering, going forward, is there any plan to look at research with that added understanding that all districts are not equal, even if they're LCFF funded? We certainly know that basic aid districts, which get the uplift from property taxes, which are tied to housing costs, which are tied to cost of living. So they should be doing better. But what about LCFF districts that are thus handicapped? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Does anybody want to take it on? Yeah? No. I was looking at Pam. I was thinking, Pam, maybe you want to take this one on. No? No. Not necessarily. There's a mic coming your way. We were just talking so much about this.
Well, no, we did have some conversations about this during lunch or before lunch. I think one of the things that I look at is how to compare one locale to the next based on the cost of living. Even looking at other states, you may have one state saying, well, we are 7th in per pupil spending, and we agree with supporting teachers, but at the same same toll, we have such a high cost of living that it just impacts everything across the state. So I don't know what the answer is. Maybe there's some kind of discount, if you will, or some kind of other piece of data that we need to put in the dashboard to kind of look at the metrics you mentioned. I don't know if that's something that more people would want to look at. I don't know if parents would want to see that. But I think that might be helpful when we're comparing apples to oranges, because the information really isn't at top of mind when we look at the dashboard or any other metrics.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I don't know if people doing this work in the early childhood space, but I think we're increasingly needing to, because we have such a long way to go. I do have some colleagues who I know are looking at this just in LCFF more generally in K-12 spending, and my colleague Heather Rose at UC Davis is doing this, and several others. But I take important note on the need to do it in the pre-K space. I think it's just very understudied and understood. Okay, do we have any others? So I like that PACE's conferences in the last couple of years since we've started them are also about learning from you, partly because we know how great, just the richness of the audience that we draw. So we're going to put you a little bit to work, and there are note cards on your table. So we want you to first think about and discuss this question around the set of conditions that that you believe are necessary from the organization and your prior experience from where you sit from. The conditions that are necessary to strengthen K-12 to post-secondary intersegmental collaborations, and we're open to the discussions from pre-K to K-12. At the local, regional, and state level, and I'll just add Joel's important reminders that they're not maybe just conditions, but competencies or cognitive shifts. I think that's a nice addition. And I think we know that we're excited by the fact that the governor has put the data part on the table, and so feel free to sort of, now that we're going to move in that, what do we need to know? But more than just the data, sort of the conditions and the cognitive shifts. And so to have that conversation, I'll only give you about 8 minutes so that then we can hear back from you. But if you're shy to speak up afterwards, we still would love to hear on the card what you believe about this, and leave it in the bowls that are on your tables so that we can pick them up. So about 8 minutes to do some talking to the tables around you or the one you're sitting at, and then we'll wrap up. So thank you. Yes, please.
So we came up on policy, right? So for us in the K-12 system, especially high school system, that underserved third, right? So for us, it's frustrating that there's no collaboration or there's no policy in place for social services or probation to work, make them work with the high school. Because right now, we just perpetuate the same problem. So when I go in, I want to know what worked at juvenile hall for this kid while he was in there. So what worked for juvenile hall? Okay. So what worked for this kid that while he was in juvenile hall? You guys had group therapy going on, blah, blah, blah. What worked for him? Well, I can't share that with you. That's all confidential. So when the kid comes back, I don't know what services to provide. So we just perpetuate the problem, right? The system and structure of failure, right? Continues. Same thing with foster youth. When I asked a social worker, how come I wasn't invited to the child family team meeting? Well, we don't really want you there. And when we've been invited, we sit there, then they ask us to leave. Because we don't want you to hear the rest of the story. That's not being collaborative. And I'm not at the table to discuss what services need to be provided at the school site for that foster youth kid to get him to be successful. So that's tying public education behind, tying their hands to service the needs, even though we're getting money for it.
Yeah.
So I would advocate for policy between public education, social services, and probation.
Yeah, I think, do you want to say something?
So can we just, I just want to add a little bit to that, because when we had talked about policy, I know the conversation kind of went to data sharing. And I think that for a practitioner, it's not so much about the data, it's actually the person next to you that, having them work with you and when they're in different sectors. So what are some policies that we need to start thinking about so that we're requiring people from different segments to work together?
I want to underscore that I think that I'm glad we definitely didn't want it to be just about data, because so much of the time the data just tell us where there maybe is hope, positive things going on or really negative things, but it rarely tells us anything about why, right? I mean, and so I think you're just raising really important questions about that. Did you want to add, Cecilia? You were.
I don't think these are working, but I just want to add that for me, that's maybe the rethinking even of the intersegmental word, because it has to be across agencies, sectors. So I think we need to come up with another term so that we can open the door for these things, because if we don't, we keep remaining, like you said, reproducing the same problems and not addressing the needs of the kids who need the most. Yeah. So and we need to find another way to convey the need to work with other services, organizations, sectors.
And I think your point about policy and Mike's point about structure is really where it's at, right? It's sort of disrupting the existing policies and structures that prevent us from being able to do that. Okay, so please, if you are willing to leave some of your comments and notes, it's all right. On a note card in the bowls on your table, then we'll at PACE be able to pick them up and also learn more about what you care about. And then I will let you maintain we're ending on time, so please let's thank our panelists again. And there's coffee out there. And then please come back for our closing plenary with Professor Linda Darling-Hammond, who'll be in this room in 15 minutes. So thank you.